It's a delight for me to be home here in Hungary. As you can see, my last name, this is the only place in the world where my last name is spelled correctly. And the reason for that is that its origins are here in Hungary, having a father who was, a grandfather, I guess, who was born here. This is the only place that I can get true chicken paprikash and palacsintas the way my mother used to make them. So it's a delight to have this opportunity. Let me express my gratitude to the Hungarian Statistics Office and Director Vukovic. Hungary has a rich tradition of volunteering. This is nothing new. What is really spectacular and unusual about Hungary is that its statistics agency also has a spectacular history of engaging and studying volunteering, going back at least 20 years in its current rendition. And I'm told going back even longer than that in history, studies of volunteering in the 1930s, if I understand correctly. And it's delightful as well to hear the seriousness with which the other ministries of the government have begun to take volunteering. And so this is a country that I think has much to be proud of in its work on volunteering. And it's a delight to see that you are one of the very first countries in the world to take on the responsibility of administering, implementing this new ILO manual on the measurement of volunteering. What I want to do is three things in the time that I have. First of all, I want to just repeat some things that some other people have said, but perhaps put a bit more information on the table to answer the question, why is it so important to measure volunteering? Secondly, I want to talk a bit about the question of how we went about designing this ILO manual. How do we go about measuring volunteering, and why did we take the approach that we did, and where does that approach stand compared to all the other things we might want to know about volunteering? And then finally, I want to just add a few words to what Eva talked about so well, and that is what progress has been made already in moving ahead with this idea of measuring volunteering around the world. So let me begin with the first question, why measure volunteering? And I think there are at least three answers to that question. The first answer is, in a sense, the most basic. We don't realize it, but the volunteer work is just an enormous renewable resource for social problem solving around the world. You know, the idea of a renewable resource has emerged in the discussion of the environment. But the truth is that people, of course, are our most valuable renewable resource. And the scale of volunteering already around the world is really quite extraordinary. We've been doing work, as you may know, at our center, but with colleagues around the world, including here in Hungary, trying to get a handle on the scale and scope of the entire nonprofit sector around the world. And in that nonprofit sector, of course, there is an enormous amount of volunteering. And what we discovered is that this sector, the entire nonprofit institution sector, is really an enormous global force. This is a picture of the data that we've gotten on the employment in nonprofit organizations around the world. As you can see in some of the European countries, it's upwards of, if you include volunteers, 15 or 16% of the economically active population. That's a huge component of the labor force of countries. And it's interesting to hear the Deputy Minister talk about the role of volunteers in the labor force, but the same thing could be said more generally about the whole nonprofit sector. In many countries, particularly in Western Europe, it is probably the largest component of all industries in those countries. The statisticians break economies into 18 different industries, and if you thought of the nonprofit sector as an industry, it would probably have the largest workforce of all. This is the rest of the countries. These data on Hungary are pretty old. We're hoping to update them, but there were about 2% of the workforce, even in the late 1990s, already employed in the nonprofit sector. And what's important about that is that globally, volunteers make up about 44%, almost half, of the labor force of the nonprofit sector around the world. We've converted the number of volunteers into full-time equivalent workers and compared that to the paid workers and come to the conclusion that volunteers are just an enormous part of the labor force. And we used that data when we were able to convince the UN Statistics Division to issue a new handbook on nonprofit institutions. For the first time, as I'll indicate later, they agreed that the measurement of volunteer work needs to be included in the picture of the economy that is given out in regular national accounts data. And so this is a huge labor force, and we have made projections, as you heard from the ambassador. I was delighted to hear that she has gotten her hands on some of our data. The number of volunteers is huge. If you add up our estimate of the total number of volunteers around the world, it comes to close to 1 billion adults. And if you think of that as a country, if you thought of volunteer land as a country, if we could get all the volunteers together on one piece of land, it would be the second most populous nation on the earth, behind only China in terms of the scale of the adult population. And so the volunteers of the world are an enormous army, if you think of them collectively. In Europe, we estimate that the volunteer labor force is larger in population than any single country in Europe. About 115 million people are volunteers at some point in Europe. And so Europe is, in a sense, a very hot spot for volunteers. And if we put a value on that volunteering, use even a very conservative estimate of what the replacement cost of the volunteers would be, what would it cost to replace those hours in those jobs, we come up also with a very significant figure. And the one way to see that is to compare the value of the contributions of time to the value of contributions of money, which are two different parts in the way of philanthropy. We tend to think of philanthropy in terms of cash, of people making financial contributions, but people can also make contributions in the form of time. And if we put a value on that, even conservatively, it turns out that the value of the contributions of time are twice as big globally as the value of the contributions of cash. Another way to see this is to think of the volunteering army as a economy. What scale of economy would it be if we put a value on it? And there again, the figures are really striking. This compares the EU volunteer economy versus selected national economies, and so it comes out to be the 7th largest in Europe. And if we look at this, so there's volunteer land, 282 billion euros, almost as big as Sweden, a little bigger than Poland's economy. And if we do that internationally, compare it to the global economies of the world, it turns out to be the 7th largest economy in the world with about 1.3 trillion US dollars, bigger than Canada, behind France. And so we're talking about an enormous economic presence. It is a tremendous renewable resource for social and economic problem solving. So that's the first reason why it's important to capture this sector, because it has so far been invisible. And when things are invisible, they are not taken seriously. And this is such a significant presence that we need to begin to take it much more seriously. The second reason is all the impacts that volunteers have, not only on the people who are affected by the volunteering, by the beneficiaries of volunteering, but it also has enormous impacts on the volunteers themselves. There's been a fair amount of research that's been done. It's not totally conclusive, and it's not comprehensive, and it's got lots of variation to it. But there is, as one author put it, overwhelmingly positive data and evidence on the impact of volunteering on health. Volunteers, it turns out, live longer, they're happier, they're physically healthier, they're less depressed. Volunteering apparently makes people feel good. And there are lots of psychological and medical reasons to explain this, having to do with the support that people get when they volunteer, the general sense of well-being that they get. And the interesting thing in this year of active aging across Europe, these positive effects of volunteering are especially important for the elderly. And this holds across the board. It holds for mental health, it holds for physical functioning, it holds for life satisfaction, it holds for perceived health. Volunteers, particularly elderly volunteers, are much better off than non-volunteer elderly. And part of that comes out of the social effects of volunteering. It's not simply the act of volunteering, it's the connections that volunteering produces. And this will become an important point when we look at some of the data that so far emerged in other countries in this part of the world, and that I think you'll hear coming out of the data on Hungary as well. So health is improved as a result of volunteering, and so has what sociologists and economists are now referring to as a different form of capital, not economic capital, not physical capital, not human capital, the skills of people, though volunteering affects that as well, but also on what's called now social capital, that is the bonds of trust and reciprocity that exist among people and that have turned out to be extremely important for democracy and extremely important for the market system to function effectively. And countries that have extensive volunteering also turn out to have higher levels of social capital, and there's a connection between the two that has been verified by pretty decent research. And I will not go over the data on this, but these charts are the result of surveys that have been done by volunteers, comparing them to non-volunteers across several dimensions of trust. And in each case, there's a tendency for people who are volunteers to have higher levels of trust than people who don't volunteer. The third reason why it's important to measure volunteering, Eva has already commented on, but let me just reinforce the point. And that is that up till now, the data that exists on volunteering has been terrible. The data that I've shown you that's come out of our research project, the Johns Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project, is the only comparative data that's existed. And to be honest, we only focused on what's called organization-based volunteering. But that data are old now, and we have not had a sufficient way to measure volunteering. The fact is that the data that exist are based on small samples. There was recently a Gallup poll, for example, of volunteering across Europe. The samples were about 1,000 individuals. The data was unbelievable. It showed that there was higher volunteering in places like Kyrgyzstan than there was in Sweden. And every piece of research that's been done previously would show that Sweden has the highest levels of volunteering in the world. They simply have data that you just can't believe. Many of the surveys have impractical recall periods. This is a tender subject here because I think the statistics agency here used the year-long basis for the recall. When we did the ILO manual, we came up with a different recall period. That's the period over which people are asked, did they volunteer? It's very hard for me to think about what I did last week, let alone how much of volunteering I did over an entire year. Typically, these surveys have neglected to ask a very basic question: how many hours did you volunteer? So we know how many people did it, but we don't know how many hours. And without the hours, it's very difficult to assess what the value is. There's very uneven use of prompts. Most of the data that exists shows that the more prompts you use on a survey, the more volunteers you find. And up to a point, it makes sense to use prompts, but if you overdo it, you get people essentially answering, yeah, I did that, just get out of my house and stop asking me questions. And so the care has to be taken in how many prompts are used on these survey forms. There's frequently limited coverage, limited classification of activities, different definitions, and a general tendency to neglect direct volunteering, and it's the things you do for your neighbor, as the ambassador was saying. And so if you look at even one country that has pretty good data on volunteering, you come up with very different stories depending on the survey that was used. So these are all data on the UK, and depending on the survey and the year and the number of prompts, here are the measures of formal volunteering through nonprofits. In the time use survey, it came out at 2% of the population. There was then a survey in 2010, this is the Gallup Worldview survey, it came up with 29%. There was a 1997 survey that had about 30 prompts, and it told us that there were 48% of the population volunteering. Well, it can't be true. You cannot have that big diversity. And here's, if you throw in so-called informal volunteering, that is direct neighbor-to-neighbor volunteering, the numbers also are kind of wildly out of line, anything from 10% up to 74% of the UK population volunteering. And so at the end of the day, we're just left completely uncertain. And this was the conclusion that came out of an EC report that was done at the launch of the Year of the Volunteer. This was a study that was done in 2010. And they basically concluded that the need for more accurate and detailed data on volunteering has been highlighted in all member states. Information data relating to volunteering are often unstructured and non-standardized even at the national level. So there is a significant problem, but fortunately with the data that was available, actually these are, I changed the order, I'm kidding. So as I said, the United Nations was persuaded in 2003 to make the measurement of volunteering a high priority. And with that mandate, we were able to approach the International Labor Organization and basically convince them that the neglect of this crucial part of the labor force was something that was really an embarrassment for an agency that purported to be reporting on the world's labor activity. And we were able to convince the International Labor Organization to give us the authority to try to write a manual that would guide statistical agencies on how to measure volunteering. And they gave us a challenge that if we could come to their once every 5-year gathering of labor statisticians, the next one was at that time scheduled for November 2008, and present a document that we could persuade them to accept, that they would issue it as a formal document. And so we got to work, our team at Johns Hopkins, but we formed a technical experts group. And the first question we had to answer, of course, was what should we study? What should we try to measure? There are many things that one could measure. And so let me turn to this second question that I said I would answer when I started. How do we measure volunteer work? What do we measure? And there were lots of thoughts about how to do this. But our decision was, for example, some people said we should really focus on the barriers because that's what's most relevant for policy. Other people wanted us to focus on policy issues. What are the policies in Europe or elsewhere in the world towards volunteering, and what impact do they have? Can you encourage volunteering? Others wanted to focus on the infrastructure. Many people, particularly within the volunteer community, wanted us to focus on what the impacts are. The impacts on beneficiaries, the impacts on volunteers, and the impacts on society. Each of those had a compelling argument to be made for it. But our feeling was that proceeding in that way is like building a house from the top down. And that what was really urgently needed was to build the foundation and start building the house up. And so we decided that we would focus on building the foundation of knowledge about volunteering across the world as the most useful step to be taken, with the understanding that others could come along, and perhaps us at a later date, and go to work on those other features that are also important to know about volunteering. And so we focused on the basic questions. Who volunteers? What do they do? How much do they do it? Where do they do it in terms of organization and field? And what is the value of it? Can we put an economic value at least on it, recognizing that it has all these other values as well, psychological and social and so forth. This is the UN handbook that I mentioned, which called for the creation of satellite accounts on nonprofits and included volunteer labor within it. And so with this decision made to focus on the foundations, we then had to come up with a set of criteria to guide our work in figuring out how we were going to proceed. And we had a set of such criteria. First of all, we said to ourselves, we need to develop a procedure that is comparable across countries. It's no use designing it to be working only in one country or one region. we had to come up with something that was universal, and that's why we formed a technical experts group with participation from all the regions of the world, from Latin America, from Central Europe, from Western Europe, from Asia, from Africa. It was a very strong team of people. Secondly, we tried to constrain ourselves to focus on the feasibility of the actual implementation of whatever we came up with. Many of us were very imaginative in all the wonderful things we thought we would like to do, but at the end of the day, if we didn't design something that the Hungarian Statistical Office and its counterparts elsewhere in the world could actually feasibly carry out, we were producing a wonderfully academic process that never would get implemented. And so we thought very hard about how to make it feasible. Thirdly, an aspect of feasibility that was particularly relevant was cost effectiveness. We needed to realize that there are constraints on statistical agencies. Therefore, creating a new survey with entirely new procedures would have been unworkable and not cost effective. And so we tried to think very carefully about how to make it cost effective. Fourthly, we wanted to find an efficient way to do this. And we came up, we think, with one that I'll describe to you. That is, we wanted to find the maximum amount of information we could get with the minimum amount of effort and work. And this involved thinking about putting the survey that we had in mind onto another survey so that we could piggyback onto that survey and get a lot of extra data that we wouldn't even have to go about asking. And then finally, at the end of the day, we were insisting that this be truly empirically systematic and reliable. And so after several years of effort, we did go before this ILO Conference of Labor Statisticians. We got the go-ahead for a volume that looks like this, the Manual on the Measurement of Volunteering. Key features of the approach that I need to call your attention to. First of all, we made this very strategic decision, even before we went to the ILO, that the best way to move ahead was to tie the measurement of volunteering to the labor force surveys that are carried out by countries around the world. These are massive surveys, very large samples. In Hungary, as I understand it, these are continuous surveys. That is, portions of the population that are part of the survey focus are surveyed on a regular ongoing basis so that you eliminate the regional or the time of the year differences. They're done by super competent technicians who understand employment, understand occupations, and who therefore can translate a volunteer piece of work very quickly into an occupation, which then can be translated into a wage. And so it solves the problem of putting a value on it. We used a very broad definition, but we did not use the word volunteering because we know that word carries a lot of freight, and therefore we were warned that we should not use that word because of the differences, different meanings that it has in different national settings. Our basic volunteer definition took the form of this statement. Let me just call your attention to several items in this definition. We refer to it as unpaid, non-compulsory work, so there's an element of volunteering to it, but it's also work, and work is different from entertainment. It is something that you would imagine if you had to do, have to hire somebody to do, you would have to pay them. And so playing the piano in your home is not work, that's something you do for your enjoyment. Playing the piano at a nursing home for elderly people is something that would be called work because it would be something that you could conceivably be paid for. Second key feature, so it's work. Third key feature is it's without pay, and there are long descriptions in the manual about what is meant by without pay. There are certain forms of reimbursement that are permissible, but fundamentally this is work without pay. And the fourth key feature is that it could be done either through organizations or directly for others. And so we specifically made a decision, really pressed on us by some of the participants in the technical experts group, that we include volunteering that's done for neighbors, but we stipulated that it not be done for members of one's own household. So it's through organizations or directly for others, but only others outside your own household. We came to that conclusion through lots of long debate. We wanted to say something about not doing it for your family, but even definitions of what a family is differ pretty strongly from place to place. And so out of this came a pretty significant vehicle, a very short survey module, about a page and a half, asking a series of questions about volunteering. It is a not terribly burdensome and not very extensive survey, but very strategically structured. We used a 4-week reference period. That is, we ask a person in their house, these are household surveys that were recommended, did you do any of this unpaid work, non-compulsory unpaid work for somebody outside your household over the past 4 weeks, thinking that this is a period that people really could pin down and think of. The focus of the survey throughout is the activity. We asked the person, what did you do? And the person will say, I ladled soup in a soup kitchen, or I did accounting work for an organization. And the interviewers, since they're fairly skilled in occupations, can translate into an occupational code. There are these international standard occupational codes, and they in turn are linked to national level wage levels. And so from the activity, we can quickly go straight on to understanding what the value of this is. And then finally, we used in this survey module a short introductory statement of the sort that I just described, but then had a series of prompts for people who said, no, I don't do any of that. And so we wouldn't have to ask the prompts to everybody, which is what eats up the time in an interview and raises the cost of doing interviews. So with that kind of structure, we have now begun to build the base on which we can generate all the other data. And we're now in the process, as Eva indicated, of implementing this handbook across the world, starting in Europe, because Europe had the Year of the Volunteer. And I won't dwell on this because I think Eva has already laid it out, but we formed a European volunteer measurement project made up of some partner organizations that Eva's already mentioned. We got to work to translate the manual and disseminate it. We mobilized a volunteer community. We began to connect to statistical agencies like the Hungarian Statistics Agency and the Polish one and other ones across the continent. And we began to move the volunteer measurement idea onto the European policy agenda. And so, as Eva indicated, we've gotten statements of support from most of the key EU policy level organizations. And we are hard at work getting commitments and actual implementation. This will give you a sense of who's committed to implementing the entire United Nations Handbook on Nonprofits. But we've already got 12 countries that have committed to implementing the ILO manual. And the results are already coming in. Poland, for example, has already finished it. So let me just close by introducing the Polish data, because it'll be interesting to you as you compare it to what's coming out of Hungary. Poland had a very interesting story. On the one hand, it appears that the Polish volunteering rate is on a par with other countries, which was a gigantic surprise. About 30% of the people in Poland were found to be doing some kind of volunteering. That compares with 27% in the US, so it's above the US rate, which is astounding when you remember the data that the ambassador was giving us. Canada edges them out a little bit, but Poland's in the same league. That's the good news, though. When you deconstruct that a little bit, it turns out that the vast majority of the volunteering in Poland is volunteering that is directly neighbor to neighbor, which is great, but it's a different kind of volunteering. And so if you compute this as a percent of the population, 26% of the Polish population does direct volunteering, some kind of helping neighbors. Only 10% do organization-based volunteering. And why is that important? Well, if you remember what I said, many of the social benefits of volunteering really come out of the social connections that are made through volunteering. The direct volunteering is a very lonely form of activity. And so if there's one policy recommendation that came out of that in the context of Poland, it was that efforts ought to be made by the Polish government to wrap around the people that are doing this individual volunteering, find ways to bring them together as a group so that they get some of the social benefits out of volunteering. It's an enormous army, but it's a lonely army and could benefit from the kind of support that policymakers and volunteer support agencies can give to them. There are a number of next steps. We need to be sure in Hungary, and I think we have that commitment, that the volunteer survey is done on a regular basis. I feel confident that that commitment has been made, and I think the presence of the director of the statistics agency with us today is, I think, a sign of that. But we have a number of other things. We need to promote implementation elsewhere in the continent. There are a number of countries that have yet to really buy into this and accept it. We need to secure buy-in from Eurostat, which is the 6,000-pound gorilla in the statistical community that pretends that it has no impact on decisions, that everybody is making decisions independently and they're just recording them, but in truth has enormous impacts on the statistical community, and has not yet seen fit to impose or request or suggest or recommend the adoption of this ILO manual. I think feeling that they've asked a lot of statistical agencies already. We need to build on these foundations by getting the rest of the job done. The broader impacts of volunteering need the same kind of statistical attention that we're now able to give to these foundation elements. Strengthening the infrastructure and assessing what aspects of infrastructure have the biggest payoff. These are ongoing requirements. We've got to make sure that we assemble the data that's coming out of this, and this is a commitment that we've made in our center to try to keep a collection of these data so that we can report on them in comparative forms. And then we have to not forget that the volunteering work is guided, geared, and connected to the UN nonprofit handbook, which is the vehicle for getting the entire third sector onto the economic map of the world. So Hungary is in the leadership position in this field, and we hope that it will sustain that position. And I look forward to hearing the results of your first implementation of the ILO manual later in the